Every empire has a man it fears more than its enemies. In the kingdom of Veyron, that man stood on the black marble balcony of Ironcrest Castle, watching his land stretch toward a horizon that bent to his name. Duke Kaelor Voss, conqueror of 3 border provinces, architect of the most brutal political machine the realm had ever produced. The court whispered that nothing could break him. They were wrong. Something already had. She had vanished 10 years ago, carrying his unborn child into the storm, and the man who controlled everything had been unable to stop the one departure that mattered. This is the story of what that absence built, and what happened when she came back. Stay until the end. The morning Seraphine Vale's name resurfaced in the capital, Kaelor Voss had already destroyed 2 men before breakfast. Not physically. That would have been beneath him. He destroyed them the way he destroyed everything, with precision, patience, and a total absence of mercy. The first was Lord Harwell, a minor baron who had been skimming grain taxes from the northern territories for 6 years. Kaelor laid the evidence across the war table in the great hall of Ironcrest Castle, every ledger entry annotated in his own hand, every falsified seal matched against the originals. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. By the time Harwell's stammering defense collapsed into silence, his lands had already been reassigned, his titles revoked, his family given 48 hours to vacate the ancestral estate they had held for 9 generations. The second was Sir Aldous Crane, the man Harwell had bribed to look the other way. Kaelor stood at the head of the table, tall and angular in a black coat that made his shoulders look like the edge of a blade. His dark hair was cut short, military style, and the scar that ran from his left temple to his jaw caught the candlelight like a second mouth. He was 37 years old. He looked older, not from age, but from the particular kind of erosion that comes from never allowing yourself a moment of weakness. "You signed off on every shipment," Kaelor said, his voice flat as riverstone. "For 6 years." Crane stood rigid across the table, sweat beaded along his receding hairline. "Your Grace, I can explain." "You can't." Kaelor placed both hands on the table and leaned forward. "That's what makes this interesting. You're going to try, and you're going to fail, and then you're going to realize that I already know every word you're about to say, because I've known about this for 3 years." The silence in the great hall was absolute. 12 advisors sat frozen in their high-backed chairs. None of them breathed. 3 years? Crane whispered. "I wanted to see how far you'd go." Kaelor straightened. "Congratulations. You went further than I expected. That takes a particular kind of stupidity. Your Grace, please. Your commission is revoked. Your pension is forfeit. You will leave the capital by nightfall." Kaelor turned his back and walked toward the window. "If you're still within my borders by dawn, I'll have you tried publicly. And Sir Crane, I don't lose public trials." The door closed behind Crane with the finality of a coffin lid. Kaelor stood at the window and stared out at the city below. The capital spread beneath Ironcrest like a wound, sprawling, ancient, and perpetually infected with ambition. Smoke rose from the merchant quarter. Cathedral spires pierced the gray sky. Somewhere in the maze of cobblestone streets, 10,000 people were scheming, lying, stealing, and surviving, all under the long shadow of the man who owned the stone beneath their feet. He owned all of it, and none of it filled the hollow behind his ribs. That was the thing about Kaelor Voss that nobody in the court understood. They saw the ruthlessness. They cataloged the destroyed rivals, the seized territories, the crushing efficiency of a man who treated governance like warfare. What they never saw was the architecture underneath. The careful, deliberate construction of a man who had decided years ago that if he could not control the one thing that mattered, he would control everything else instead. His steward, Marin Holt, entered the hall after the last advisor filed out. Marin was a thin woman in her 50s with steel-gray hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch her face into a permanent expression of skepticism. She had served the Voss household for 20 years and was the only person in the empire who could enter Kaelor's presence without being announced. "Lord Harwell is requesting an audience," she said. "Denied. He says he has information about the succession crisis." Kaelor turned from the window. "Everyone has information about the succession crisis." Half of it is fabricated, the other half is weaponized, and none of it changes the fact that the king is dead, and nobody can agree on what happens next. King Aldrich had died 3 months ago. No clear heir, no designated successor. The empire had been fracturing ever since, rival factions circling the empty throne like wolves around a carcass. Kaelor had received 14 separate proposals of alliance in the past week alone. He had rejected all of them. "There's something else," Marin said. She hesitated, and the hesitation itself was remarkable, but Marin Holt did not hesitate. "Speak." "A noblewoman arrived in the capital this morning. She came through the eastern gate with an escort of 40 armed riders and requested an audience with the Regency Council." "Another claimant," Kaelor said dismissively. "She gave her name as Lady Seraphine Vale." The room went silent, not the silence of empty space. The silence of something detonating so deep underground that the surface hadn't cracked yet. Kaelor's hand, which had been reaching for a document on the table, stopped mid-motion. His fingers hung in the air for exactly 2 seconds. Then they closed into a fist. "Say that again." "Lady Seraphine Vale," Marin repeated. Her voice was careful now, measured. "She has a child with her, a boy, approximately 10 years old." The mathematics of that sentence hit like a blade between the ribs. 10 years. 10 years since the night she vanished. 10 years since he woke to find the bed empty, the wardrobe cleared, her riding cloak gone from the hook by the door. 10 years since he stood in the freezing courtyard at 3 in the morning, screaming her name into a storm that swallowed every sound he made. He had searched for 2 years, sent riders to every province, bribed informants in every port city, burned through a fortune tracking rumors that led nowhere. He had interrogated her maid, her childhood friends, the stable boy who saddled her horse. Nothing. She had evaporated as completely as if the storm itself had consumed her, and now she was here, in the capital, with a child. His child. "Where is she staying?" The words came out flat, controlled. Underneath them, something vast and dangerous was shifting. "The Thornfield estate, Lord Ashworth's old property. It's been vacant since his execution." "Who arranged it?" "Unknown. She appears to have resources. The escort was well-armed, well-equipped. Professional soldiers, not mercenaries." Kaelor walked to the fireplace and braced both hands against the mantel. The fire popped and hissed. His reflection stared back at him from the polished stone, older, harder, with eyes that had forgotten how to be anything other than weapons. Seraphine. The name alone was enough to crack the foundation of every wall he had built since she left. He remembered the first time he saw her. The great hall of Ashenmore, her father's crumbling estate, where the political marriage had been negotiated with all the warmth of a livestock transaction. She had stood by the window in a gray dress that was 3 seasons out of fashion, her auburn hair pulled back in a simple knot, and she had looked at him with an expression he could not immediately classify. Not fear, not deference, not the calculating appraisal he was accustomed to receiving from women whose families were bargaining their bodies for political advantage. She had looked at him the way a soldier looks at a battlefield, assessing the terrain, measuring the distance, deciding where to make her stand. "You're smaller than I expected," she had said. It was the first sentence she ever spoke to him. He was 6'2". "And you're more direct than your father warned me about," he had replied. "My father doesn't know the half of it." The marriage had been a transaction, her family's remaining lands and title legitimacy in exchange for the financial resources to prevent total ruin. Kaelor had agreed because the Vale territories bordered 3 contested provinces, and controlling them consolidated his eastern flank. It was strategy, nothing more. That lasted approximately 4 weeks. The transition from strategic arrangement to something far more dangerous happened in stages he did not recognize until it was too late. Seraphine refused to behave like a political wife. She attended his council meetings uninvited. She questioned his decisions in front of his advisors. She reorganized the household accounts within the first month and presented him with a report showing that his own comptroller had been embezzling modest but consistent sums for over a decade. "You're welcome," she had said, dropping the ledger on his desk. "I didn't ask for your help." "You didn't need to. The numbers were screaming." He fired the comptroller that afternoon. He did not thank her. She did not expect him to. That more than anything was what undid him. Her complete indifference to his approval. She did not need him to validate her competence. She did not need him at all, and that drove him absolutely insane. Their arguments were legendary within the castle walls. Servants learned to identify the particular timbre of Seraphine's voice when she was about to tell the most powerful duke in the empire that he was wrong, and they would quietly clear the corridors. Kaelor, who had never raised his voice in a political negotiation, found himself shouting across dinner tables, slamming doors, pacing the hallways at midnight because she had said something at supper that burrowed into his brain and refused to leave. "You don't want a wife," she told him one night, standing in the doorway of his study while he pretended to read correspondence. "You want a territory, something you can draw a line around and say, 'mine,' and never think about again. That's not true. Then stop treating me like a border dispute." He had looked up from the desk. She was wearing a nightgown, her hair loose around her shoulders, and the candlelight turned her skin the color of warm copper. She was the most infuriating person he had ever met. She was also the most beautiful, and the most dangerous, because she was the only person alive who could walk into his study uninvited and say something that actually landed. "I don't know how to do this," he said. It was the most honest sentence he had spoken in years. "I know," she said. "That's the only reason I'm still here." The passion that followed was not gentle. It was not the soft, gradual unfolding that poets described in their verses about noble love. It was a collision. Two people who had built fortresses around themselves, discovering that the walls they constructed to keep the world out had also locked something vital inside, and the only way to reach it was through each other. Kaelor had spent his entire adult life perfecting control. Seraphine dismantled it without trying. She did not attack his defenses. She simply walked past them, as if they were not there, and touched the parts of him that nobody else knew existed. The terrified boy underneath the duke. The man who had watched his own father die of poison in a political assassination at the age of 12, and decided, in that terrible moment, that he would never again be vulnerable to anything. She made him vulnerable to everything. And then she left. Kaelor released the mantle and turned to face Merrin. "I want a full intelligence report on her movements, where she's been, who she's been with, how she got those soldiers, every detail." "Already in progress, Your Grace. And I want the Thornfield estate watched, every entrance, every exit. Nobody comes or goes without my knowledge." "Understood. One more thing." He paused. The fire crackled behind him. "The boy, do we have a description?" Merrin's expression shifted, the barest flicker of something that might have been compassion, quickly suppressed. "Dark hair. Tall for his age. The initial reports say he carries himself like—" She stopped. "Like what?" "Like you, Your Grace." Kaelor closed his eyes. When he opened them, whatever had been visible in his expression for that brief, unguarded moment was gone, sealed behind the mask he had spent a decade perfecting. "Prepare my carriage," he said. "I'm going to the Thornfield estate." "Now?" "Your Grace, perhaps it would be advisable to—" "Now, Merrin." The carriage ride through the capital took 30 minutes. Kaelor spent every one of them staring out the window without seeing anything. The city scrolled past. Market squares, military barracks, the towering facades of noble houses draped in banners whose colors shifted with every change in political wind. He registered none of it. He was thinking about the night she disappeared. They had been married for 14 months. She was 3 months pregnant. He had known about the pregnancy for only 2 weeks, and the knowledge had done something to him that he was still, a decade later, unable to articulate. It was not joy. Joy was too simple a word. It was more like terror, the specific, paralyzing terror of a man who suddenly realizes that the most important thing in his life is something he cannot control, cannot fortify, cannot defend with political maneuvering or military force. A child. His child. Growing inside the one person he could not afford to lose. He had doubled the castle guard. He had dismissed 3 servants whose backgrounds he could not fully verify. He had begun sleeping with a blade beneath his pillow, which Seraphine discovered and removed every night, placing it on the bedside table with a look that said more than any argument could have conveyed. "You can't fight everything," she told him once. "Watch me. That's exactly what I'm afraid of." He did not understand what she meant. Not then. The carriage stopped at the iron gates of the Thornfield estate. The old property had been built a century ago, a sprawling stone manor surrounded by overgrown gardens that had once been the pride of the capital's social elite. Now the hedges grew wild, the fountains were dry, and the windows stared out at the street like empty eye sockets. Armed guards flanked the entrance. They were exactly as Marin described, professional, well-equipped, wearing no house sigil. They watched the carriage approach with the disciplined stillness of soldiers who had seen real combat. Kaelor stepped out before his own guards could form a perimeter. He walked toward the gate with the deliberate, unhurried stride of a man who had never in his life waited for a door to be opened for him. "Tell your mistress," he said to the nearest guard, "that her husband is here." The guard did not flinch. He spoke without looking away from a fixed point somewhere above Kaelor's shoulder. "Lady Vale said to expect you." "Lady Voss," Kaelor corrected, and the correction came out sharper than he intended. The guard said nothing. He simply stepped aside and gestured toward the front entrance. The hallway inside was lit with candles that threw long shadows across stone walls. The air smelled of dust and something else. Lavender, faint but unmistakable. Seraphine had always kept dried lavender in her clothing trunks. The scent was a ghost from another life, and it hit Kaelor in the chest like a fist. He followed a servant through the hall and into a drawing room that had been hastily furnished with borrowed chairs and a writing desk covered in documents. Maps, he noticed. Military maps. Territory assessments, the kind of documents that belonged in a war room, not a ladies' salon. And there she was, standing by the window, 10 years older, 10 years harder. Her auburn hair was shorter now, cut just below her jaw, and there were lines around her eyes that had not been there before. She wore a dark blue coat over riding clothes. Practical, unadorned, nothing like the gowns she had worn at Ironcrest. Her posture was different too. The young woman who had challenged him with her directness had been replaced by someone whose stillness carried the weight of a decade spent surviving in places the Empire's maps did not reach. She turned when he entered. Their eyes met. The room contracted to the space between them. "Kaelor?" she said. Her voice was the same, steady, clear, with that particular inflection that had always made his name sound like both a greeting and a warning. 10 years, he said. "That's a long time to be dead." "I wasn't dead. You were to me." She absorbed that without flinching. He wanted her to flinch. He wanted to see the impact of those words register somewhere on her face, some crack in that impossible composure, some evidence that the years had cost her as much as they had cost him. Nothing. "Where is the boy?" he said. "Safe." "That's not what I asked." "It's the only answer you're getting, for now." He took a step forward. She did not step back. He took another. The distance between them closed to 6 feet, 5, 4. He could see the pulse in her throat, fast, faster than her expression suggested. Good. She was not as calm as she wanted him to believe. "You took my son," he said, and his voice dropped to the register that made diplomats go pale. "You vanished without a word. You let me believe for 10 years that you betrayed me, and you walk back into this city, into my territory, and you think, your territory." She repeated the words with a precision that turned them into a blade. "That's exactly the problem, Kaelor. That's always been the problem. Everything is your territory, your lands, your castle, your wife, your child. You think love is a deed of ownership. Don't. Don't what? Tell you the truth? You never wanted the truth. You wanted compliance. I wanted you." The words escaped before he could stop them, raw and unfinished, and the sound of his own honesty in that dusty room was more frightening than anything the Regency Council had ever threatened. Seraphine's composure cracked, just barely, a tightening around the eyes, a slight tremor in the jaw. She looked away toward the window, and when she spoke again, her voice carried something he had never heard in it before. Exhaustion. "I know," she said quietly. "That's why I had to leave." "Explain that to me. Make it make sense." She walked to the writing desk and placed her hand on the stack of documents. Maps, intelligence reports, letters bearing the seals of houses he did not recognize. "Do you know why the Regency Council has been so eager to fill the vacancy left by King Aldrich's death? Because they want the throne. Every faction in the Empire wants the throne. No, they want what the throne controls, specifically the ducal territories. Your territories, Kaelor. They have wanted them for 20 years. Every move the Council has made, every alliance, every trade agreement, every convenient death, has been designed to weaken your position until they could seize your lands without triggering a civil war. I know this. I've been fighting them for... You don't know the half of it. She pulled a document from the stack and held it out. The assassination attempt, the night I left. You thought it was a random attack. Bandits. Opportunists. My investigators concluded your investigators were compromised. 2 of them were on the Council's payroll. The attack was ordered by Chancellor Draven Ashmore himself. The name landed like a hammer. Draven Ashmore. Kaelor's oldest political ally. The man who had stood beside him at his father's funeral. The man who had brokered the marriage to Seraphine. The man who had wept. When Seraphine disappeared and had personally led the first search party. No, Kaelor said. Yes. Draven has been bleeding you dry for 20 years, Kaelor. Every piece of advice he ever gave you was designed to isolate you. Every alliance he brokered was calculated to leave you dependent on the Council. And when I became pregnant, when you suddenly had an heir who could secure your bloodline and your territories permanently, the timeline accelerated. You're lying. I have the documents. Letters in his own hand, financial records. Witness testimony from 3 former Council agents who defected to my alliance over the past 6 years. I have everything, Kaelor. She set the paper down and looked at him with an expression he could not read. Why do you think I came back now? Not because the king is dead. Because I finally have enough proof to burn the entire conspiracy to the ground. The room was very quiet. Kaelor stared at the document in her hand. His mind was doing what it always did, calculating, assessing, searching for the angle, the trap, the hidden motive. Draven Ashmore, 20 years. Every piece of advice designed to isolate him. He thought about the decisions he had made on Draven's council, the alliances rejected, the marriages declined, the provinces he had refused to fortify because Draven assured him the threats were manageable. A pattern emerged, ugly, vast, and unmistakable. If this is true, he said slowly, then every move I've made for 2 decades has been exactly what they wanted. He looked at her across the dim, dusty room. His wife. The woman he had married for strategy and loved against his will. The woman who had fled into a storm carrying his child and spent 10 years building something he could not yet see. And the boy, he said. Cassian. Where is he? Before Seraphine could answer, the door behind them burst open. Maren Holt stood in the doorway, her face drained of color. Your Grace, she said, and her voice was a sound Kaelor had never heard from her. Not in 20 years of service. Pure, unfiltered fear. Chancellor Ashmore has convened an emergency session of the Regency Council. They've declared Lady Vale a fugitive and an enemy of the crown. She paused. And they've issued a warrant for the arrest of the boy. Kaelor moved before the fear had time to settle. That was the thing about him that separated the Duke of Voss from every lesser man who had ever held power in the kingdom of Veyron. He did not freeze when the ground shifted beneath him. He calculated. The way a wolf calculates the distance between itself and the throat. Not because it chooses violence, but because hesitation is a luxury that dead things once enjoyed. How long ago? He said. Maren was still gripping the doorframe. The declaration was issued 20 minutes ago. Council riders are already moving through the city. How many? At least 40, armed with royal writs. Kaelor turned to Seraphine. She had not moved from the writing desk, but her hand had shifted, slowly, deliberately, to the leather satchel resting against the chair leg. The movement was so controlled it was almost invisible. Almost. You knew this was coming, he said. I knew it was possible. There's a difference between possible and 20 minutes from now, Seraphine. There's also a difference between a warrant and an arrest. She pulled the satchel onto the desk and opened it. Inside were more documents, tightly rolled, secured with black ribbon. They can issue whatever they want. Executing it requires soldiers willing to cross you. They have soldiers. They have council guards. You have an army. An army I can't mobilize in 20 minutes. You don't need an army. She looked at him, and something in her expression shifted. The same look she had given him years ago, standing in his study doorway, telling him things he was not ready to hear. You need to decide whose side you're on. The question hit him like a slap, not because it was unfair, because it was the one question he had been avoiding since the moment Marin spoke her name an hour ago. Whose side? For 10 years, Kaelor had operated within a framework he understood completely. The Empire had rules. The Regency Council had authority. Chancellor Draven Ashmore was an ally. Imperfect, occasionally self-serving, but fundamentally aligned with the Voss interests. That framework had governed every decision Kaelor made, every alliance he forged, every enemy he crushed. And now Seraphine was telling him the framework was a cage, built by the man he trusted most, designed to hold him exactly where his enemies needed him. "Your Grace," Marin said from the doorway, her voice tight. "We need to move. Now." Kaelor looked at the documents on Seraphine's desk, then at Seraphine, then at the window behind her, where the gray light of the Capitol filtered through dusty glass. "Where's the boy?" he said. "Not here." "Seraphine? He's safe. He's been safe for 10 years because I never kept him anywhere anyone expected. That includes you." She held his gaze without blinking. "I will take you to him, but not until I know you understand what we're walking into. I understand that 40 armed men are headed to this estate to arrest a child. They won't find him here. I told you. I've been preparing for this." "Preparing?" He tasted the word like ash. "You've been preparing for 10 years while I sat in Ironcrest running an empire that was apparently designed to consume me." "Yes." The honesty was brutal. She did not soften it. She did not apologize. She stood behind that single word the way a fortress stands behind its walls, immovable, unyielding, and completely indifferent to whether the person looking at it found it beautiful or terrifying. Kaelor made his decision in the space between one heartbeat and the next. It was not a rational decision. It was not strategic, calculated, or politically sound. It was the decision of a man who had spent 10 years trying to fill a hole in his chest with power and territory and control, and who was now standing 3 feet from the only person who had ever made that hole feel like something other than a wound. "Marin," he said without turning around, "send word to Captain Aldrich. I want 50 of my household guard at the eastern gate within the hour. Full armor, no house banners. Your Grace, if you deploy household troops against council riders, I'm not deploying against anyone. I'm relocating my personal security detail. If the council has questions, they can submit them through proper channels." He paused, "which I will ignore." Marin stared at him for 3 full seconds. Then she nodded once and disappeared into the hallway. Kaelor turned back to Seraphine. "Show me the documents." She spread them across the desk. Maps first, not the standard imperial cartography he was accustomed to, but detailed intelligence maps showing troop movements, supply routes, and communication networks spanning the past decade. Then came the letters, dozens of them, written in a cipher that Seraphine decoded with practiced fluency, translating as she went. "Draven began corresponding with the Eastern Lords in the year before our marriage," she said, her finger tracing a line of encoded text. "The initial proposal was simple. The Voss territories were too large, too wealthy, and too strategically positioned for any single duke to hold. The council needed to fragment them. And the marriage was the delivery mechanism. If we produced an heir, the council would have leverage, a child they could control, manipulate, eventually use to challenge your authority from within your own bloodline. If we didn't produce an heir, your territories would revert to the crown upon your death, which the council controlled. A trap either way. The perfect trap, the kind where the victim builds his own cage and calls it home." Kaelor read the letters in silence. The handwriting was unmistakable. He had seen Draven's script on 1,000 documents over the years. The looping D, the sharp A, the way he pressed too hard on downstrokes. These were genuine. The content made his stomach turn. Draven's correspondence with the Eastern Lords read like a surgeon's notes, clinical, precise, devoid of sentiment. Each letter outlined a specific phase of the operation. Phase 1. Isolate Kaelor from potential allies by engineering conflicts with neighboring houses. Phase 2. Control his intelligence network by placing council agents in key positions. Phase 3. Eliminate any personal attachment that might give him motivation beyond territorial ambition. Phase 3. Seraphine. The assassination attempt, Kaelor said, his voice very quiet. The night you left. 2 men, professional. They came through the service passage behind the kitchens. She spoke about it the way soldiers speak about engagements they survived, detached, factual, with the emotional content locked away in a compartment that only opened at 3 in the morning. I killed the first one with a fire iron. The second one ran. I found this on the body. She produced a small leather case from the satchel. Inside was a medallion, tarnished silver, bearing a symbol Kaelor recognized immediately. The Chancellor's personal seal. Not the official seal of office that appeared on state documents. The private mark that Draven used on personal correspondence. He sent them to kill you, Kaelor said. He sent them to kill the child. I was secondary. A pregnant duchess who dies in a robbery. Tragic, but manageable. The narrative writes itself. Kaelor set the medallion on the desk. His hand was steady. The rest of him was not. 20 years. 20 years of counsel and alliance and carefully cultivated trust, and every single moment of it had been a performance. Every sympathetic word after Seraphine's disappearance, every concerned inquiry about the search, every toast raised at state dinners to the enduring strength of House Voss, all of it theater, all of it designed to keep him blind while the empire was dismantled around him. Something shifted in Kaelor's chest. Not rage, not grief, but something colder and more fundamental. The recognition that the man he had been for the past 20 years was a construct. A puppet dancing on strings he could not see, performing a role in a play written by someone who understood him well enough to exploit every weakness, every blind spot, every inherited assumption about loyalty and power and how the world was supposed to work. He had spent his entire adult life believing that control was safety, that if he could just hold tightly enough to his lands, his authority, his reputation, nothing could touch him. Draven had used that belief like a weapon. I need to see the boy, Kaelor said. Seraphine studied him. Whatever she was looking for, whatever test she was running behind those careful eyes, took less than 5 seconds to complete. Follow me, she said. They left through a rear exit that opened into the overgrown gardens behind the estate. Seraphine moved through the tangled paths with the ease of someone who had memorized the layout, which meant she had been in the capital longer than she admitted. Kaelor filed that information away without comment. 2 of her guards fell into step behind them. They moved like shadows, silent, efficient, communicating with hand signals that Kaelor recognized as military-grade field protocol. Whoever had trained these men had done it properly. Where did you find soldiers like this? He asked. I built them. From what? From the same place you build anything worth having, from people who had nothing left to lose and everything to prove. They crossed the garden and exited through a gate concealed behind a wall of overgrown ivy. A narrow alley led to a secondary street, then another alley, then a courtyard attached to a modest stone building that looked like a merchant's warehouse. Inside, the building had been converted into something else entirely. The ground floor was a command center. Maps covered every wall. Messengers moved between stations with the quiet urgency of a military operation in progress. In the corner, a woman in her 30s with a shaved head and a scar across her nose was coordinating communications using a system of color-coded flags that Kaelor had never seen before. This is Commander Lyris Sable, Seraphine said. She runs my intelligence network. Lyris looked up from her station and assessed Kaelor with the flat, unimpressed gaze of someone who evaluated threats for a living. Your Grace, she said. The greeting contained no deference whatsoever. How large is this operation? Kaelor asked. Large enough, Lyris said. That's not an answer. It's the answer you're getting until Lady Vale says otherwise. Kaelor turned to Seraphine. Your people are as charming as you are. I didn't hire them for charm. A staircase at the back of the room led to the second floor. Seraphine paused at the bottom, her hand on the railing, and for the first time since he had walked into the Thornfield estate, Kaelor saw something unguarded in her expression. Not vulnerability. Seraphine did not do vulnerability the way other people did, with trembling lips and wet eyes. Hers was structural, a shift in the load-bearing walls, a momentary exposure of the architecture underneath. "He knows about you," she said quietly. "He's always known. I never lied to him about who his father was." "What did you tell him?" "The truth. That you're the most powerful man in the empire. That you're brilliant and ruthless and terrifying, and that I left to protect him from people who would have used him to destroy you." "Did you tell him I would have protected him myself?" The silence that followed was its own answer. "I told him," she said finally, "that you would have tried." She turned and walked up the stairs. Kaelor followed. The second floor was divided into living quarters. Simple, functional, with the impersonal efficiency of military housing. At the end of a narrow hallway, a door stood slightly ajar. Through the gap, Kaelor could see a table, books, a half-finished game of chess. Seraphine pushed the door open. The boy was sitting by the window, reading. He was tall for 10. Marin had been right about that, with dark hair that fell across his forehead and a jaw that was already sharpening into angles Kaelor recognized from his own mirror. But it was the eyes that stopped him, dark gray, watchful, carrying an intelligence that was almost unsettling in a child. Cassian looked up from his book. Father and son stared at each other across a room that suddenly felt like the largest space in the empire. "You're taller than I thought," Cassian said. The echo hit Kaelor so hard he nearly stopped breathing. The same cadence, the same directness, the same refusal to perform deference. It was Seraphine's voice coming out of his own face, and the combination was so precise, so devastatingly specific, that it bypassed every defense he had ever built and struck something underneath that he did not have a name for. "Your mother said the same thing," Kaelor managed, "the first time we met." "I know, she told me." Cassian closed his book and stood. He was composed in a way that no 10-year-old should be, the composure of a child who had grown up understanding that the world was dangerous and that survival required paying attention. He crossed the room and stopped 3 feet from Kaelor, studying him with those gray eyes that missed nothing. "Are you going to help us?" Cassian asked. "Yes." "Because you want to, or because you have to?" The question was so sharp, so surgically targeted, that Kaelor almost laughed. Almost. "Both," he said. "Good." Cassian nodded, as if confirming a hypothesis he had been testing. "Mother said you'd say something like that. She said you're honest when you're caught off guard." Kaelor looked at Seraphine. She was standing in the doorway with her arms crossed, watching the exchange with an expression that contained multitudes: fear, pride, grief, and something fierce and protective that burned behind her eyes like a signal fire. "He's been studying the political situation," Seraphine said. "Maps, intelligence reports, council records. He understands more than most adults in the capital." "I'm standing right here," Cassian said. "You don't have to talk about me like I'm in another room." Kaelor looked at the boy, at his son, at the decade of absence compressed into a single human being who stood before him with his mother's spine and his father's eyes, and a directness that belonged to neither of them and both of them at once. "You're right," Kaelor said. "I apologize." Cassian tilted his head. "Mother said you never apologize." "Your mother hasn't seen me in 10 years. People change." "Do they?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Before Kaelor could answer, footsteps thundered up the staircase. Lyris appeared in the hallway, breathing hard, her face stripped of its earlier composure. "Council riders just hit the Eastern District," she said. "They're not coming for the Thornfield estate." "Where?" Seraphine said. "Here, someone talked. They know about the warehouse." The room shifted. Seraphine moved first, grabbing Cassian's arm, pulling him away from the window. Kaelor stepped into the hallway and looked down the staircase. Below, the command center was already transforming. Messengers burning documents, operatives collecting weapons, the ordered machinery of a decade-long operation collapsing into evacuation protocol with practiced efficiency. "How many?" Kaelor asked. 60 riders, plus foot soldiers. They brought 100 men to arrest a child." "They brought 100 men to arrest your child," Lyris corrected. "There's a difference." Kaelor turned to Seraphine. She was already moving, pulling Cassian toward a rear corridor that led, presumably, to another concealed exit. Her guards materialized around them like ghosts. "We have a secondary location," she said. "But if they've compromised this one, they may have the others mapped. Then your secondary location is useless." Kaelor walked to the window at the end of the hallway and looked down at the street. Council riders were visible at the far end of the block, armored, carrying the blue and silver banners of the Regency Council. Moving fast. He made a decision. "Marin should have my household guard at the eastern gate by now," he said. 50 men, full armor. 50 against 100? 50 Voss household guards against 100 council riders. He looked at her. "Those aren't even odds, Seraphine. Those are an insult. To them." He strode down the staircase and into the command center, where Lyris was coordinating the last of the evacuation. "Commander, I need a messenger who can reach the eastern gate in under 10 minutes. Lyris pointed to a young man near the door. "Rena, fastest runner in the city." "Captain Aldrich at the eastern gate," Kaelor told the runner. "Full deployment to this location. Authorization code Ironfall." He paused. "And Commander, stop burning those documents. We're going to need them." Lyris looked at Seraphine. Seraphine looked at Kaelor. Something passed between them in that look. Not trust, not yet, but the recognition of a shared calculation. The moment you stop running, you start fighting. And fighting requires a different kind of architecture than survival. It requires standing still in a place where standing still can kill you. "You understand what this means," Seraphine said. "If you deploy household troops against the Regency Council, it means I'm choosing a side. It means war, Kaelor." He looked at her, at the boy standing behind her, watching him with those gray eyes that carried the weight of every year they had lost. At the command center filled with people who had spent a decade building something from nothing because one woman had refused to let a conspiracy swallow her family whole. "No," he said. "War started 20 years ago. I just didn't know I was already in it." He turned to Lyris. "Secure every exit. Nobody leaves. Nobody enters until my guards arrive. And if the council riders get here first, then they get to explain to Chancellor Ashmore why they drew weapons against the Duke of Voss." His jaw tightened. "And I get to explain to Chancellor Ashmore why that was the last mistake he ever made." Outside, the sound of hoofbeats grew louder. 60 riders closing fast through the narrow streets of the capital, carrying warrants signed by a man who had spent 20 years engineering this exact moment, the moment when Kaelor Voss would be forced to choose between the empire he thought he served and the family he never knew he had. Kaelor drew his sword. It was not a ceremonial gesture. The blade was plain, battle-worn, with a nick near the hilt from a border skirmish 7 years ago. He held it the way he held everything, with total commitment and absolute refusal to let go. Seraphine moved to stand beside him. Not behind him, beside him. "Together?" she said. He looked at her. The woman who had walked through fire and exile and a decade of invisible warfare to stand in this exact spot, at this exact moment, offering him the one thing he had never known how to accept: partnership. Not possession, not control, not ownership. The thing he had mistaken for weakness his entire life, and which turned out to be the only weapon that mattered. "Together," he said. The first council riders appeared at the end of the street. Their blue and silver banners snapped in the wind. Their commander raised his hand, signaling the column to halt. And from the opposite direction, the thunder of 50 Voss household guards in full battle armor turned the corner and filled the street like a wall of iron. The two forces faced each other across 100 yards of cobblestone. Nobody moved, nobody breathed. And somewhere in the heart of the city, in a chamber draped in velvet and lies, Chancellor Draven Ashmore received word that Duke Kaelor Voss had drawn steel against the Regency Council. The old man's hand trembled as he set down the message. Not from fear, from recognition. The puppet had found the strings. The standoff lasted 11 minutes. 11 minutes of horses stamping on cobblestone, of armored men staring across 100 yards of street with their hands on weapons they were not yet authorized to use, of the entire political architecture of the Kingdom of Veyron, balanced on the question of who would blink first. Nobody blinked. The council commander, a square-jawed officer named Tarek, whose reputation for following orders exceeded his capacity for independent thought, sat motionless at the head of his column, while Captain Aldrich's 50 Voss household guards, formed an unbroken wall of black iron across the opposite end of the street. The mathematics were simple: 60 council riders against 50 Voss veterans. The council had numbers. The Voss guards had something council riders did not possess and could not purchase: the absolute bone-deep certainty that the man they served would burn the world before he let them down. Tarek broke first. He dispatched a rider back to the council with a message requesting revised orders. The column held its position but drew no weapons. It was not a retreat. It was a pause. And pauses, in the language of imperial politics, meant that someone higher up the chain needed to decide whether this particular confrontation was worth the price of starting it. Kaelor watched from the second-floor window of the warehouse, his sword still drawn, his reflection ghosting across the glass like a second version of himself. The one who existed underneath the title, beneath the territory, behind every carefully constructed wall. The man who had just committed the single most reckless act of his political career by deploying household troops against the Regency Council. 20 minutes ago, he would have called this insanity. Now it felt like the first honest thing he had done in 20 years. "They're holding," Lyris reported from behind him. "Commander Tarek sent a rider back to the council complex. We have maybe an hour before Ashmore decides his next move." "Less than that," Seraphine said. She was standing at a map table in the corner, studying troop positions with the focused intensity of someone who had been running war games in her head for a decade. "Draven won't escalate here. Street combat in the capital damages his narrative. He needs to look like the legitimate authority, not the aggressor." "So what does he do?" Kaelor asked. "He changes the arena." Seraphine placed her finger on the map, pointing to a massive structure at the city's center. "The Golden Citadel. Emergency session of the full Regency Council. He'll invoke emergency powers, declare you in violation of the Crown Authority Act, and issue an order stripping your titles. Legally, publicly, in a form where raw military force is irrelevant. He can't strip a ducal title without a unanimous council vote, which he'll have, because every member of the council either owes him something or fears him, most of them both." Kaelor turned from the window. The firelight from the command center below threw moving shadows across the ceiling, and in their shifting geometry he saw the shape of his own miscalculation, the fundamental error he had been making for 2 decades. He had believed that power resided in territory, in troops, in the physical control of land and resources. Draven Ashmore understood something different. Power resided in narrative. In the story the Empire told itself about who was legitimate, who was criminal, and who deserved to rule. Draven did not need to defeat Kaelor on a battlefield. He just needed to make Kaelor the villain in a story the Empire already believed. "Then we go to the Citadel," Kaelor said. Lyris looked at him as if he had suggested walking into a furnace. "That's exactly what he wants." "Yes, it is. And we're going to give it to him." "Kaelor," Seraphine said. The use of his first name stopped everything. She crossed the room and stood in front of him, close enough that he could see the amber flecks in her dark eyes. "If we walk into that chamber, we're walking into a space Draven has controlled for 20 years. His allies, his procedures, his rules. We will be outnumbered, outmaneuvered, and legally defenseless unless we bring something powerful enough to break his entire framework." "You said you had proof." "Letters, financial records, witness testimony." "I do." "Then we bring the proof." "It's not that simple." She hesitated. And again, the hesitation itself was the tell. Seraphine did not hesitate. She assessed, she decided, she moved. When she paused, it meant the thing she was about to say carried weight she was not certain the room could bear. "The documents prove Draven's conspiracy, but proving it requires establishing their authenticity, chain of custody, verification of handwriting, corroboration from credible witnesses." "You said you had witnesses." "I have 3 former council agents who defected. All of them are currently outside the Empire's borders. Getting them to the capital in time for an emergency session is impossible. Difficult, not impossible, but it requires time we don't have." The room fell silent. Kaelor could hear the horses outside, the distant shouts of the council riders relaying positions, the low hum of Lyris's communication network processing incoming intelligence. Every sound was a clock ticking toward a confrontation he was not prepared for. Then Cassian's voice came from the doorway. "You don't need the witnesses." Everyone turned. The boy was standing at the top of the staircase, his dark gray eyes moving between his parents with the calculating focus of someone who had been listening to every word and processing it faster than anyone in the room expected. "Cassian, go back upstairs," Seraphine said. "You don't need the witnesses," he repeated, ignoring her completely. "You need one witness who's already in the capital, someone the council can't dismiss, someone whose testimony carries automatic legal weight." Kaelor studied his son. The precision of the boy's thinking was extraordinary, not precocious in the way of children who memorize facts to impress adults, but genuinely analytical, strategic. "Who?" Kaelor asked. "Lord Protector Aldrich Vale." The name landed like a blade in the floor. Seraphine's face went white. Not pale, white. The color of someone who has just heard the name of a ghost spoken aloud in a room full of the living. "No," she said. "He's alive," Cassian said quietly. "He's been in the capital for 3 weeks." Kaelor looked between mother and son. Lord Protector Aldrich Vale, Seraphine's father, the patriarch of the fallen Vale house, the man who, according to every official record in the Empire, had died of consumption 7 years ago in exile. "Seraphine," Kaelor said carefully, "your father is dead." "My father is not dead." The words came out of her like stones being pulled from a wall that had been holding back a river. "He staged his death to escape the council's surveillance. He's been operating under an assumed name in the capital for 3 weeks, gathering his own evidence against Draven." "And you didn't tell me this." "I didn't tell you because I didn't know." She turned to Cassian. "How do you know this?" "Commander Lyris's intelligence network picked up a communication 3 days ago. An encoded message using the old Vale cipher, the one you taught me when I was 7. I decoded it." Cassian's voice was matter of fact. "Grandfather is alive. He's been watching us since we arrived, and he wants to meet." The room recalibrated. Lyris was already at her station, pulling up communication logs with rapid, efficient movements. Seraphine stood motionless in the center of the room, her composure not cracked, but shattered. The internal architecture that had sustained her through 10 years of exile and warfare, suddenly inadequate to process the revelation that her father, the man she had mourned and memorialized and used as the bedrock of her own survival mythology, was alive. 3 days, she said to Cassian. "You've known for 3 days and you didn't tell me. I needed to verify it. You're 10 years old. I'm your son." He said it without defiance, without pride, with the simple, devastating accuracy of a child who has learned that age is irrelevant when survival depends on information. Kaelor watched the exchange and felt something rearrange itself in his understanding of the past decade. Seraphine had not simply been surviving in exile, she had been building. And the thing she had built, this network, this alliance, this child who could decode military ciphers and analyze political strategy at 10, was not a defensive structure. It was a weapon, pointed directly at the heart of the Empire. "Where is he?" Kaelor asked. "The old merchant district," Cassian said. "He's using the name Aldous Greer. He runs a bookshop on Candler's Row." "A bookshop? It's a front. The basement is a communications hub connected to a network of loyalists who never accepted the Council's version of his death." Kaelor turned to Lyris. "Can you confirm any of this?" Lyris pulled a communication log from her files and handed it to Seraphine. "The encoded message is real. I flagged it 3 days ago but couldn't break the cipher. Your son apparently can." Seraphine read the message. Her hands were steady, her jaw was not. A muscle worked along the hinge of her mandible, the only visible evidence of the seismic event taking place beneath her surface. "It's his cipher," she said finally. "The specific variant he used during the Northeastern campaign. I taught it to Cassian because..." She stopped. "Because I wanted him to have something of his grandfather's." "Then we go to him," Kaelor said. "Now, before the council session." "It could be a trap," Lyris said. "The council could have broken the cipher, fabricated the message, planted it for us to find." "It's not a trap," Cassian said. "How do you know?" "Because the message contained information that only my grandfather would know. Specific details about the night my mother left Ironcrest. details that were never in any official report. The silence that followed was loaded with the particular tension of a room full of people who were all recalculating simultaneously. Kaelor watched Seraphine's face and saw the war playing out behind her eyes, the desperate need to believe against the decade-long discipline of never trusting anything she could not personally verify. "We go," Seraphine said. "But carefully. Lyris, I want a surveillance team on Candler's Row in advance. Map every exit, every approach. If it smells wrong, we pull out." "And the council riders?" Lyris asked. "Captain Aldrich holds the perimeter," Kaelor said. "Nobody in, nobody out. If Tarek's men try to advance, Aldrich has standing authorization to hold the line." They moved. The journey through the capital's back streets took 40 minutes. Seraphine led them through a labyrinth of service alleys and covered passages that she navigated from memory. Another indication that her intelligence operation in the capital was far more extensive than she had initially revealed. Kaelor followed with 2 of his personal guards, while Cassian walked between his parents with the alert, watchful silence of a child who had grown up understanding that the space between safety and catastrophe was measured in seconds. Candler's Row was a narrow commercial street in the old merchant district, lined with shops that had seen better centuries. The bookshop was exactly where Cassian said it would be. A modest storefront with faded gold lettering on the window that read, "Greer and Sons Booksellers." Seraphine stopped outside the door. For the first time since she had re-entered Kaelor's life, she looked uncertain. Not afraid. Uncertainty and fear were different animals, and Seraphine had long ago tamed the second while learning to respect the first. She stood on the cobblestones with her hand raised toward the door handle and did not move. "I mourned him," she said. Not to Kaelor, not to Cassian, to the air, to the decade, to the elaborate architecture of grief she had built inside herself and was now being asked to demolish in a single afternoon. "I know," Kaelor said. She pushed the door open. The shop was small, dusty, and crammed with books arranged in the particular chaos that suggested either a madman or a genius. Behind the counter stood a man in his early 70s, tall, thin, with a shock of white hair and the kind of face that had been handsome 30 years ago and was now merely distinguished. He wore a shopkeeper's apron over a wool vest, and his hands, resting on the counter, were covered in ink stains. He looked up when they entered. His eyes, dark gray, identical to Cassian's, identical to the eyes Seraphine had inherited and passed on, found his daughter's face and held. "You cut your hair," Aldrich Vale said. Seraphine made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a sob. It was the sound of a structural beam giving way, the deep, resonant crack of something that has been holding too much weight for too long. "You died," she said. "Only technically." He came around the counter and stood before her, father and daughter. 7 years of fabricated death between them. He did not embrace her. She did not reach for him. They stood 3 feet apart and let the space between them hold everything that words would have cheapened. "The boy," Aldrich said, turning to Cassian. "You decoded my message." "It wasn't difficult," Cassian said. "It was designed not to be. For you." The old man studied his grandson with an expression that contained something ancient and fierce. The recognition of legacy, of bloodline, of the specific patterns that DNA carries forward like encoded instructions for how to survive. "You have your mother's mind, and my father's stubbornness," Seraphine said. "That too." Aldrich's gaze shifted to Kaelor. The warmth vanished. What replaced it was the cold, appraising assessment of a former Lord Protector evaluating a man he had once considered not good enough for his daughter. "Duke Voss." "Lord Vale." "You deployed troops against the Regency Council this morning." "I did. Draven Ashmore will use that to destroy you." "I know." "And you came here because my daughter believes I can help prevent that." "I came here because your grandson says you have evidence that can expose Ashmore's conspiracy in front of the full council." Aldrich Vale reached beneath the counter and produced a leather case, old, worn, secured with 3 separate locks. He set it on the counter and rested both hands on top of it. "I have more than evidence," he said. "I have the original correspondence between Draven Ashmore and the Eastern Lords. Not copies. Originals. Bearing his personal seal, his handwriting, and his signature on every page. I have financial records from the council's hidden treasury showing 20 years of payments to assassins, informants, and compromised officials. And I have something Draven does not know I possess. He opened the case. Inside, beneath layers of oilcloth, was a single document. It was old. The parchment yellowed, the ink faded, but the seal at the bottom was unmistakable. The royal seal of the crown. Not the administrative seal used by the council. The personal seal of King Aldrich himself, after whom Seraphine's father had been named. A royal decree, the old man said, signed by King Aldrich 6 months before his death. It names Duke Kaelor Voss as Lord Protector of the realm in the event of the king's death without a clear heir. It supersedes the Regency Council's authority entirely. The room went very still. "The king named me Lord Protector?" Kaelor said. "He did." Draven intercepted the original decree before it could be entered into the official record. He believed it was destroyed. It was not. "How did you get it?" "I stole it. From Draven's private vault, 17 years ago. It is the reason he had me killed." Aldrich paused. "Or tried to." Kaelor stared at the document. The implications cascaded through his mind like falling architecture. If this decree was genuine, then the entire Regency Council was operating without legitimate authority. Every order, every appointment, every act of governance since the king's death was legally void. Draven Ashmore had not simply conspired against House Voss. He had committed treason against the crown itself. "We take this to the council session," Kaelor said. "We present the decree, the correspondence, the financial records." "No." The voice came from behind them. Everyone turned. Marin Holt stood in the doorway of the bookshop. She had entered silently, so silently that none of Seraphine's guards, none of Kaelor's personal detail, none of Lyrus's surveillance operatives positioned on the street outside had detected her approach. She was not alone. Behind her stood 8 men in unmarked armor. They were not council riders. They were not soldiers of any house Kaelor recognized. They were ghosts, the kind of operatives who existed in the spaces between official structures, who answered to no banner and left no trace. Marin's face was calm, composed. The same expression she had worn for 20 years of loyal service, the unshakable efficiency of a woman who anticipated every need before it was spoken. "Marin," Kaelor said, "what are you doing?" "What I've been doing for 20 years, Your Grace." She stepped into the shop. "My job." The temperature in the room dropped by 10 degrees. "You work for Draven," Seraphine said. Not a question. "I work for the Empire." Marin's gray eyes swept the room. Kaelor, Seraphine, Cassian, the old man behind the counter with 17 years of stolen evidence laid out on the wood. Chancellor Ashmore doesn't need witnesses or financial records to win the council session. He needs the decree. She looked at the document on the counter. "And now I know where it is." Kaelor could not move. It was not the physical threat. He had faced armed men before. It was not the tactical disadvantage. 8 operatives in a confined space against his 2 guards and whatever resources Seraphine could bring to bear. It was the betrayal itself, the sheer, perfect, crystalline architecture of it. Marin Holt, 20 years. She had been there when his father died. She had helped him dress for his own wedding. She had stood beside him the morning Seraphine vanished and handed him the reports, one after another, tracking search parties that were never going to find anything because the woman coordinating them already knew where Seraphine was, or at least knew who had driven her away. Every cup of tea she had brought him, every document she had organized, every quiet word of counsel she had offered in the hours when the castle was empty and the silence felt like it might finally crush him. All of it. Every moment. Performance. Something inside Kaelor Voss did not break. Breaking implied structural failure, a thing that comes apart because it cannot withstand the load. What happened inside him was different. It was more like a controlled demolition, the systematic, deliberate destruction of a foundation that had been built on lies, and the terrifying recognition that the man standing in this bookshop was not the man who had walked in. That man had believed he understood betrayal. He had filed Seraphine's departure under that heading for a decade. He had used it as fuel, as justification, as the central narrative of his own hardening. He had been wrong. He had not known what betrayal was. Betrayal was not the person who ran. Betrayal was the person who stayed, who poured tea and organized documents and said, "Your Grace," with perfect deference while feeding your enemies every secret you possessed. Merrin held out her hand. "The decree, Lord Vale, if you please." Aldrich Vale did not move. His ink-stained hands remained on the leather case, and his old gray eyes held Merrin's with the unblinking steadiness of a man who had survived assassination, exile, and 7 years of fake death, and who was not about to surrender the one document that made all of it worthwhile. "You know," Aldrich said conversationally, "I always wondered how Draven stayed one step ahead. The man is clever, but not that clever. He had help. Someone close." He looked at Kaelor. "Someone inside the walls." Kaelor said nothing. He was looking at Merrin the way a man looks at the place where a limb used to be. Not with anger, not with grief, but with the slow, nauseating comprehension of absence. "How long?" he said. "Since before your father's death." Merrin's voice did not waver. "The Chancellor approached me when I was 23. Your father had just passed me over for promotion in favor of a man with half my competence and twice my connections. Draven offered me something your family never did. Recognition of what I was actually worth. So you sold us." "I served the winning side. There's a difference." "No," Kaelor said. "There isn't." He drew his sword. Merrin did not flinch. "If you kill me, the 8 men behind me have orders to take the boy. Alive, preferably. But the Chancellor's instructions were flexible on that point." The threat settled over the room like poison gas. Cassian stood between his parents. He did not cower. He did not cry. He watched Merrin Holt with those gray eyes that missed nothing, and in his absolute stillness, Kaelor saw something he recognized. The moment a child understands, with total clarity, that the world is not what he was told it was. That the people who smile at you can be the same people who plan your destruction. That safety is not a place, but a lie that adults tell children to keep them quiet, while the real business of survival happens behind closed doors. It was the same moment Kaelor himself had experienced at 12, kneeling beside his father's poisoned body. The cycle completing itself. Seraphine moved first, not toward Merrin, toward the counter. She placed her body between Cassian and the 8 operatives and looked at Kaelor with an expression he had never seen on her face before. Not in 14 months of marriage, not in the passion that had unmade both of them, not even in the terrible electricity of their reunion hours ago. It was surrender, not to Merrin, not to Draven, to the truth that the only way through this moment required something Kaelor had spent his entire life refusing to do. "Let go." "Kaelor," she said, "put down the sword." "No." "Put it down. Fighting is what they want. It's what they've always wanted. You, alone, swinging at enemies while the real war happens somewhere you can't reach." Her voice was raw, stripped of performance. The voice of a woman standing at the exact intersection of 10 years of preparation and the 5 seconds that would determine whether any of it mattered. You can't fight your way out of this. Not with steel, not with troops, not with control. Then how? She looked at him, through him, into the architecture that was collapsing and the empty space it was leaving behind, the space where something new would either be built or nothing would stand at all. "Trust me," she said. 2 words. The 2 words that Kaelor Voss, Duke of the most powerful territory in the Empire, had never once in his adult life been able to say yes to. Trust required surrender. Surrender required vulnerability. And vulnerability, in the world his father's murder had created, was the one luxury a man in his position could never afford. Except that the man who could never afford it was a fiction. A role in a play written by Draven Ashmore and performed for 20 years by a cast that included every person Kaelor thought he knew. The only person in this room who had never performed for him was the woman asking him to trust her. The woman he had spent 10 years hating for a betrayal she never committed. Kaelor lowered the sword. Merrin smiled. It was the first genuine expression he had ever seen on her face, and it was terrible. The smile of a woman who believed she had won. "Wise choice, Your Grace," she said. "Seraphine," Kaelor said quietly, "whatever you're about to do it now." Seraphine reached into the leather satchel she had been carrying since the Thornfield estate and pulled out a small brass device, a signal flare launcher, compact, military grade. She pointed it at the ceiling and fired. The flare punched through the bookshop's wooden roof and exploded above Candler's Row in a burst of red light that was visible from every quarter of the capital. Marin's smile vanished. Within 30 seconds, the street outside erupted. Not with council riders, not with Voss household guards, with Seraphine's people. The invisible army she had built over a decade of exile, positioned throughout the capital in the weeks before her arrival, embedded in shops and warehouses and rented rooms waiting for exactly this signal. 40 soldiers materialized from doorways, alleys, and rooftops. They surrounded the bookshop in a perimeter that made Marin's 8 operatives look like children playing at war. Lyris's voice cut through the chaos from somewhere outside. "Targets contained, all exits secured." Marin looked at the soldiers closing around the shop. She looked at Seraphine, and in her eyes, Kaelor saw something he recognized. The slow, devastating comprehension of a woman who had just realized she was not the smartest person in the room. She never had been. "You knew," Marin said. "I suspected," Seraphine corrected. "I've suspected for years. I just needed you to confirm it." She gestured to a small device pinned inside her coat collar. A listening device, wired to the communication network that Lyris ran from the command center. "Every word you just said was transmitted to Commander Lyris's recording station, including your confession of 20 years of service to Chancellor Ashmore." Marin's face went blank. The composure that had been her mask for 2 decades became, in that moment, the only real thing about her. The empty, affectless expression of a woman who had run out of performances. "Secure her," Seraphine said to the soldiers entering the shop, "and the operatives. Alive. All of them." Kaelor watched Marin being led out in restraints. He watched the woman who had poured his tea and organized his world and called him Your Grace, with 20 years of practiced devotion, walk through the door of a bookshop on Candler's Row and disappear into the custody of soldiers who answered to his wife. His wife, who had built an army he never knew existed, who had suspected Marin for years and said nothing, waiting instead for the moment when the betrayal would reveal itself on its own terms, in its own voice, recorded and witnessed and irrefutable. He turned to Seraphine. She was holding Cassian against her side, her hand on the back of his head, and her face carried the expression of a woman who had just detonated a decade of preparation and was only now beginning to calculate the cost. "You used me," he said. "Coming to the capital, letting me find you, you knew it would flush out whoever Draven had inside my household." "Yes." "You didn't trust me enough to tell me." "I couldn't trust you with this, Kaelor. If you knew about Marin, your behavior would have changed. She would have noticed. The entire operation depended on you not knowing. So I was bait. You were the one variable I couldn't control." She looked at him, "and the one person I couldn't afford to lose." The words hung in the air between them, raw, unfinished, carrying the weight of a decade of separation and the impossible arithmetic of love and strategy and survival. Outside, the red flare still burned against the gray sky. Inside the bookshop, Aldrich Vale quietly locked the leather case containing the royal decree and slid it beneath the counter. "The council session convenes in 4 hours," the old man said. "I suggest we stop bleeding on each other and start planning." Kaelor looked at Seraphine, at Cassian, at the old man with ink-stained hands and a stolen decree that could reshape the empire. Then he looked at the door through which Marin had disappeared, the door through which his entire understanding of the past 20 years had walked out, leaving behind a man he no longer recognized standing in a room full of people he was only now beginning to see clearly. The Duke of Voss, the man who had built his identity on control, on possession, on the absolute certainty that strength meant holding everything so tightly that nothing could escape, stood in a dusty bookshop with an empty hand and no plan, and the nauseating freedom of a man who has just discovered that everything he thought he was protecting was already gone, and the only thing left standing was the thing he had never learned how to hold. Trust, not as a weapon, not as a strategy, not as a calculated surrender to gain tactical advantage. Trust as the terrifying admission that the strongest man in the Empire was not strong enough to do this alone, that he had never been strong enough, that the entire mythology of the solitary duke commanding his territory from a throne of iron was a story told to him by the people who needed him, isolated, controllable, alone. 4 hours, Kaelor said. His voice sounded different, even to himself, stripped of something, or perhaps filled with something, that had not been there before. Tell me the plan. Seraphine studied him across the 3 feet of dusty air that separated them. She was looking for something in his face, testing for something, and whatever she found, whatever shift in the architecture behind his eyes, told her that the man standing before her was not the same man who had walked into the Thornfield estate that morning, with a sword and a decade of fury and the absolute conviction that power was the answer to every question. She nodded. "Sit down," she said. "This is going to take a while." The plan took 3 hours to build and would take less than 30 minutes to either save the Empire or destroy everyone in this room. Seraphine laid it out on the map table in her father's basement, the real basement, beneath the bookshop, where Aldrich Vale had spent 3 weeks assembling a command infrastructure that rivaled anything the Regency Council possessed. The walls were lined with documents, intelligence reports, troop dispositions, communication intercepts dating back 17 years. The old man had not simply survived his faked death. He had weaponized it. "The Golden Citadel has 4 entrances," Seraphine said, tracing the building's layout with her finger. "The main gate, 2 service corridors, and an underground passage that connects to the old treasury vaults. Draven will have the main gate and service corridors locked down. Council guards at every checkpoint." "The underground passage?" Kaelor asked. "Collapsed. Officially. In reality, my people cleared it 6 days ago. It opens into the lower archives, which connect directly to the chamber-antechamber through a maintenance corridor." "You've had people inside the Citadel for 6 days." "I've had people inside the Citadel for 3 weeks." She did not look up from the map. "You're not the only one who plans for contingencies, Kaelor." Aldrich Vale sat in the corner, the leather case containing the royal decree resting on his knees. He had not let go of it since the confrontation with Marin. His ink-stained fingers rested on the locks, with the possessive tenderness of a man holding something that had cost him 7 years of exile, a faked death, and the loss of everything he had built in his previous life. "The decree alone won't be enough," Aldrich said. "Draven will challenge its authenticity. He'll argue it's a forgery." "Which is why we need Marin's confession," Seraphine said. Lyris recorded every word, 20 years of service to Ashmore, admitted in her own voice. Combined with the original correspondence, the financial records, and the decree, it's an overwhelming case. "Overwhelming cases lose in political arenas all the time," Kaelor said. "The council members aren't judges. They're survivors. They'll side with whoever they believe will still be standing when the dust settles. Then we need to make sure they believe that's us." "How?" Seraphine looked at him across the table. The candlelight threw shadows across her face, deepening the lines around her eyes, the set of her jaw. The particular geometry of exhaustion that comes from carrying a weight too large for any single human being for too long. "You walk in through the front door," she said. The room went quiet. "Explain." "The underground passage is for me, Cassian, and my father. We enter unseen, position ourselves in the antechamber with the evidence. But the council needs to see you arrive through the main gate, alone, unarmed, walking directly into the chamber as if you own it." "Because I do." "No, because Draven expects you to come with soldiers, with threats, with the iron fist that has defined every interaction you've ever had with the council. If you walk in alone, unarmed, and stand before them with nothing but your name, it breaks the narrative. It tells every person in that room that you're not afraid. And a man who isn't afraid when he should be is the most dangerous thing a politician has ever seen." Kaelor stared at the map. The Golden Citadel sat at the center of the capital like a gilded tumor. Massive, ornate, built 3 centuries ago to house the administrative machinery of an empire that had been rotting from the inside for at least 2 decades. Every corridor was a potential ambush. Every chamber was a stage. And the council hall itself was Draven Ashmore's theater, designed for exactly the kind of performance that turned truth into treason and loyalty into sedition. Walking in alone was either the bravest decision Kaelor had ever made or the last one. "What happens when Draven moves against me inside the chamber?" "He won't, not physically. Draven doesn't use violence in public. It undermines the legitimacy he's spent 20 years constructing. He'll use procedure, legal motions, formal charges. He'll try to strip your titles through a council vote before we can present the evidence. And if the vote happens before you reach the chamber, it won't, because you're going to give the performance of your life. Cassian had been listening from the staircase. He descended the last 3 steps and stood at the edge of the map table, his dark gray eyes moving between the schematic of the citadel and his mother's face. "I should be in the chamber," he said. "Absolutely not," Seraphine said. "The decree names father as Lord Protector, but the succession claim requires a legitimate heir to be present and recognized. If I'm not in the room when the decree is presented, Draven's lawyers will argue the claim is theoretical." "He's right," Aldrich said from the corner. "He's 10, Seraphine said. "He's the heir to the most powerful duchy in the Empire," Aldrich replied quietly, "and he's the reason all of this started. If we hide him from the chamber, we're telling the council that we don't believe our own claim is strong enough to defend." Seraphine's hands flattened on the table. She stood motionless for 5 full seconds, the duration of a woman calculating the distance between strategic necessity and maternal instinct and finding that the gap was exactly the width of her son's life. "He stays with me," she said finally, "behind me, at all times. If anything goes wrong, Lyris extracts him through the service corridor. Non-negotiable." "Agreed," Kaelor said. Cassian nodded. Once. The nod of a child who understood that he had just been given permission to walk into the most dangerous room in the Empire, and who accepted that permission with the gravity it deserved. They moved at dusk. The capital shifted colors as the sun dropped below the cathedral spires, gold to amber to the deep bruised purple that settled over the city like a warning. Street lamps flickered to life along the main thoroughfares, the usual evening commerce of the capital, merchants closing shops, taverns opening doors, the endless churn of humanity that kept the Empire's heart beating, continued with the oblivious persistence of people who did not yet know that the political order governing their lives was about to be detonated. Kaelor rode alone. No guards, no escort, no house banners. Just a man on a black horse moving through the streets of the capital with the unhurried deliberation of someone who has calculated the odds, accepted them, and decided to walk forward anyway. The city watched him pass. Merchants stopped in doorways. Street vendors went silent. A man riding without escort through a capital under political crisis was either suicidal or untouchable, and the city could not yet determine which. Kaelor felt the eyes on him and let them look. There was a strange freedom in having nothing left to protect. For 20 years, every decision he made had been weighted with the need to preserve his territory, his authority, his reputation, the carefully maintained illusion that Duke Kaelor Voss was impervious to damage. That weight had been so constant, so fundamental to his daily existence, that he had stopped recognizing it as a burden. It had become his skeleton, the thing he stood on. Now the skeleton was gone. Marin's betrayal had dissolved it. The revelation that his entire framework, every alliance, every intelligence assessment, every strategic calculation of the past 2 decades had been contaminated by an enemy operating inside his own household had left him structurally unsound. The old Kaelor, the one who rode into the capital this morning with 50 armored guards and the absolute conviction that force was the answer, was dead. The man riding toward the Golden Citadel had no such convictions. He had something worse. Clarity, the kind that comes only when everything you believed has been systematically demolished, and the rubble clears and you see the landscape for the first time as it actually is, not as your enemies designed it to appear, not as your fears shaped it, not as your own desperate need for control distorted it, but as the raw, unmediated reality of a world in which you are not the master but the student, and the tuition has cost you everything you had. The Golden Citadel rose before him. It was the largest structure in the capital, a massive complex of interconnected buildings, towers, and ceremonial halls that housed the administrative apparatus of the empire. Its facade was covered in gold leaf that caught the last light of the setting sun and threw it back in sheets of molten amber. The main gate was a pair of iron doors 40 feet high, flanked by columns carved with the figures of past monarchs, whose expressions of carved authority stared down at the arriving duke with the blank disapproval of dead men who had made better decisions than the living ones who inherited their throne. Council guards lined the entrance, 40 of them, full armor. They watched Kaelor dismount and approach the gate alone with the rigid alertness of soldiers who had been told to expect trouble and were not sure what form it would take. "Duke Voss," said the guard captain at the gate, "the council is in session. You are expected." Kaelor walked past him without stopping. "I know." The guard captain looked at the other soldiers. None of them moved. Kaelor had not drawn a weapon. He had not issued a threat. He had simply walked through a line of 40 armed men with the serene indifference of a man who understood that the real battle was happening somewhere none of them could reach, and that their swords were irrelevant to its outcome. Inside the citadel was a cathedral of bureaucratic power. Marble corridors stretched in every direction, lit by chandeliers that cast warm light across walls hung with portraits of chancellors and kings. Kaelor's boots echoed on the polished floor as he walked toward the council chamber, a steady, measured cadence that sounded like a countdown. He reached the chamber doors. 2 guards stood on either side. "Open them," Kaelor said. The guards hesitated. One of them began to speak. Kaelor looked at him. Just looked, with the flat, expressionless gaze of a man who had spent the last 12 hours having every certainty in his life demolished and replaced with something harder and less forgiving. And the guard opened the door. The council chamber was enormous. A circular room with a domed ceiling painted in gold and midnight blue, ringed by tiered seating that rose in concentric circles around a central floor. The Regency Council sat in the first tier, 12 men and women in formal robes, their faces arranged in expressions ranging from hostility to carefully maintained neutrality. Behind them, in the observation galleries, sat the representatives of every noble house in the empire. 200 people, maybe more. The political machinery of the kingdom of Veyron assembled in a single room to witness what they believed would be the formal destruction of Duke Kaelor Voss. At the center of the first tier, in the chancellor's chair, a gilded monstrosity that was 1 inch shorter than the empty throne beside it, and everyone in the room knew what that inch represented, sat Draven Ashmore. He was 73 years old, thin, precise, with white hair combed back from a face that had the architectural regularity of a man who had spent his entire life controlling the muscles beneath his skin. His eyes were pale blue, almost colorless, and they tracked Kaelor's entrance with the calm attentiveness of a predator, watching prey walk into a clearing. "Duke Voss," Draven said. His voice carried effortlessly through the chamber, decades of practice projecting authority in precisely this room. "You arrive alone, and unarmed. How unexpected." "You've been expecting me for 20 years, Draven." Kaelor walked to the center of the floor and stopped. "I thought I'd save you the trouble of pretending to be surprised." A murmur moved through the galleries. Draven's expression did not change. "You are aware," Draven said, "that this council has issued charges against you. Illegal deployment of military forces within the capital, harboring a fugitive, obstruction of council authority. These are serious allegations, Your Grace. They carry significant consequences." "I'm aware." "Then you understand that you are here to answer those charges, not to make speeches." "I understand that I'm here because you want me here." Kaelor let his gaze sweep the council tier, face by face, reading the calculations behind each expression, the fear, the allegiance, the desperate self-interest that governed every decision made in this room. "I understand that every charge you've filed is designed to create a legal framework for seizing my territories. I understand that you've been engineering this moment for 20 years, and that you believe you've accounted for every variable." He paused. "You haven't." Draven's pale eyes narrowed by a fraction of a degree. "Duke Voss, I advise you to—" "You've advised me for 20 years, Chancellor, every word calculated to isolate me, every alliance brokered to weaken my position, every investigation steered away from the truth." Kaelor's voice was steady, controlled, and utterly devoid of the fury that everyone in the room expected from the Empire's most feared duke. The absence of anger was more unsettling than any rage could have been. "You advised me when my wife disappeared. You wept for her. You led the first search party. And you knew from the beginning that the assassins who drove her away were yours." The chamber erupted. Voices from the galleries, shouts from the council tier, the chaotic percussion of 200 people processing an accusation that, if true, restructured everything they understood about the Empire's power dynamics. Draven raised his hand. The chamber went silent with the conditioned obedience of a room that had been trained to respond to that gesture for decades. "These are extraordinary accusations," Draven said, "made without evidence in a public forum by a man already facing criminal charges. I must ask the council to consider the source." "The source is 20 years of documented treason." Kaelor did not look at Draven. He looked at the council members, at the gallery, at the Empire watching him from their tiered seats with the hungry, uncertain attention of people who sensed that the ground beneath the Empire was about to shift. "And the evidence is here." The chamber doors behind the council tier opened. Seraphine walked in, not through the main entrance where Draven's guards would have stopped her, through the antechamber corridor that connected to the lower archives, the passage her operatives had cleared 6 days ago. She entered the chamber with Aldrich Vale on her right and Cassian on her left, flanked by Lyris and 4 of her soldiers carrying cases of documents. The room went silent, not the political silence of a chamber brought to order, the primordial silence of an ecosystem recognizing a new apex predator. Seraphine walked to the center of the floor and stood beside Kaelor. She did not look at him. She looked at Draven Ashmore, and the expression on her face was something the Chancellor had not prepared for. The composed, luminous fury of a woman who had spent 10 years in exile building the instrument of his destruction and who was now going to use it. "Lady Vale," Draven said. His voice was still controlled, but something had shifted in the undertones, the first hairline fracture in a facade that had held for 2 decades. "You are a fugitive from—" "My name," Seraphine said, "is Duchess Seraphine Voss. I am the wife of Duke Kaelor Voss, mother of his heir, and daughter of Lord Protector Aldrich Vale, who, as you can see, is not as dead as you arranged for him to be." The galleries roared. Aldrich Vale stepped forward, and the recognition hit the chamber like a physical force. Faces going white, hands gripping chair arms, the collective shock of an empire confronting a ghost it had been told to forget. Draven stood. The gesture was controlled, deliberate, the movement of a man whose body was executing protocols his mind had prepared for. But his hands, those thin, precise instruments that had signed 20 years of treasonous correspondence, his hands were not steady. "This is a spectacle," Draven said, "a theatrical performance designed to—" "These are your letters." Aldrich Vale opened the leather case and placed the first stack of documents on the central lectern. "Written in your hand, bearing your personal seal, addressed to the Eastern Lords. They detail a 20-year conspiracy to dismantle the Voss territories and seize control of the Regency Council. Forgeries. This is the testimony of your personal operative, Marin Holt." Seraphine placed a transcription on the lectern beside the letters. "Recorded 3 hours ago. She confesses to 20 years of embedded service in the Voss household, conducted on your direct orders, including surveillance of my pregnancy and coordination of the assassination attempt that drove me from Ironcrest. Coerced, fabricated. And this," Aldrich said, lifting the final document from the case, the yellowed parchment with the royal seal, "is a decree signed by King Aldrich himself, 6 months before his death, naming Duke Kaelor Voss as Lord Protector of the realm. You intercepted it, you hid it, and you have governed without legitimate authority since the king's death." The silence that followed was not political, it was geological. The silence of tectonic plates shifting, of a landscape being permanently rearranged by forces too large to resist and too fundamental to deny. Draven Ashmore looked at the decree, at the letters, at the transcription of Marin's confession, at the woman standing before him with 10 years of exile written in the lines of her face and a decade of preparation burning in her eyes. Then he looked at the council members, and something changed. The fracture that had appeared in his voice widened, spread, and resolved, not into collapse, but into something colder. The composure returned, the pale eyes hardened, the thin hands steadied. He was not finished. "Guards," Draven said. His voice cut through the chamber with the precision of a man who had contingency plans for his contingency plans. "Secure the chamber. Arrest Duke Voss, Lady Vale, and the pretender who calls himself Lord Protector. Charges of sedition, insurrection, and forgery of royal documents. The chamber doors slammed shut. Council guards flooded in from every entrance. Not 40, not 60, but over 100 armed soldiers pouring into the tiered galleries surrounding the central floor, weapons drawn. They had been positioned in advance, hidden in the corridors, ready for exactly this moment. Draven had known. He had known Seraphine was coming. He had known about the evidence. He had known about the underground passage, and he had prepared. "You thought I didn't expect this?" Draven said. He descended from the chancellor's chair and walked toward the central floor with the measured step of a man who had spent 7 decades mastering the art of being the last person standing. "I have expected every move you've made since the moment you crossed back into the Empire, Lady Vale. You are your father's daughter, brilliant, relentless, and fatally predictable." 100 swords surrounded the central floor. Seraphine pulled Cassian behind her. Aldrich gripped the decree. Kaelor stood motionless, his eyes moving across the disposition of guards, counting positions, calculating angles, doing the brutal arithmetic of a man surrounded by steel. "The boy," Draven said, and his eyes found Cassian with the cold precision of a man locating a strategic objective on a map. "Step forward." Nobody moved. "The boy is the key to all of this," Draven continued. "Without the heir, the decree is irrelevant. Without the heir, the Voss claim dies. Without the heir—" "Touch my son," Kaelor said, "and there isn't a corner of this empire dark enough to hide what I will do to you." His voice was not loud. It was not theatrical. It was the voice of a man who had crossed, in the span of a single day, from the person he had been to the person he was going to be, and who had discovered in that crossing that the most terrifying version of himself was not the duke who commanded armies, or the politician who destroyed rivals. It was the father, the man who had met his son 3 hours ago and had already recalibrated every priority, every value, every definition of power he had ever held, around the single immovable truth that the boy standing behind Seraphine was worth more than every territory, every title, every acre of land in the empire. A man with nothing left to lose is dangerous. A man who has just discovered what he cannot afford to lose is catastrophic. Draven studied him. The pale eyes searched Kaelor's face for the bluff, for the performance, for the calculated threat that could be managed and redirected. He did not find it. What he found was something he had never seen in Kaelor Voss in 20 years of manipulation: the absence of strategy. The pure, unmediated presence of a man who was no longer calculating outcomes, because the only outcome he cared about was standing 5 feet behind him, 10 years old, with gray eyes that carried the weight of everything the Empire had tried to destroy. Draven's jaw tightened. "Take them," he said to the guards. The soldiers moved, and from outside the golden citadel, rising through the stone walls and the sealed windows and the gold-leafed dome of the council chamber, came a sound that stopped every armed man in the room. Horns. War horns. Not council horns. Not the ceremonial brass of the Imperial Guard. The deep, bone-shaking resonance of northern battle horns, the sound that border provinces use to signal the advance of an army. Draven turned toward the sealed windows. "That," Seraphine said quietly, "would be the rest of my alliance." The sound grew, louder, multiplied. The unmistakable acoustic signature of thousands of soldiers arriving at the gates of the capital. The invisible army that Seraphine had built over a decade of exile. The force she had assembled from the margins of the empire, now converging on the golden citadel with the coordinated precision of a woman who had planned this moment the way architects plan cathedrals. Stone by stone, year by year, until the structure was too large to ignore and too solid to collapse. The council guards looked at each other, at their commander, at the doors of the chamber beyond which the horns were getting louder, closer, more numerous. 100 soldiers against an army. The mathematics had changed. Draven Ashmore stood at the center of the chamber floor, surrounded by the evidence of his 20-year conspiracy, facing the family he had spent 2 decades trying to destroy, listening to the sound of his own obsolescence arriving at the gates. His pale eyes moved to Kaelor, then to Seraphine, then to Cassian. The boy stared back at him, unflinching, unafraid. with the quiet, devastating certainty of a child who had been raised on the truth and who understood, with the clarity that only the young and the fearless possess, that the man standing before him was not powerful. He was cornered. And cornered men do the most dangerous things. Draven's hand moved to his belt, where a small blade hung in a leather sheath, ceremonial, ornate, the kind of weapon that chancellors carried as a symbol of office rather than a tool of violence. He drew it and lunged toward Cassian. Kaelor moved before his mind gave the order. There is a speed that exists beyond thought, a velocity that lives in the marrow, in the architecture of muscle memory and paternal instinct fused into a single combustion event that bypasses every rational circuit and detonates directly into action. Kaelor did not decide to step between Draven's blade and his son. His body decided. The way a heart decides to beat. The way lungs decide to fill. The fundamental, non-negotiable machinery of a man who has discovered in the span of a single day that the thing he would die for is not his territory, not his title, not the empire he spent his adult life believing was the measure of his worth. It is a 10-year-old boy with gray eyes and his mother's spine. The ceremonial blade caught Kaelor across the left forearm. It was not a deep wound. The knife was ornamental, the edge maintained for appearance rather than function. But the cut opened a 6-inch line from wrist to elbow that immediately sheeted red across his hand and onto the marble floor of the council chamber. The pain registered as a distant fact, something happening to a body that belonged to someone else. The only thing that mattered was the geometry. Draven's arm extended, the blade now past Kaelor's body, the Chancellor's momentum carrying him forward into a space where Kaelor's right hand was waiting. Kaelor seized Draven's wrist and twisted. The snap was audible throughout the chamber. Draven screamed. The blade clattered to the floor. Kaelor did not release the wrist. He held it, broken, angled wrongly, the bones grinding beneath his grip, and he pulled the old man close enough that their faces were inches apart. "That," Kaelor said, his voice a whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the silent chamber, "was the last move you will ever make." He released the wrist. Draven staggered backward, cradling his shattered hand against his chest, his face contorted in agony. The composure that had sustained him for 7 decades was gone, stripped away in the 3 seconds it took for a father's body to do what a politician's mind could not. The pale blue eyes that had calculated the destruction of House Voss for 20 years were now the eyes of a man confronting a mathematics he had never learned. The mathematics of a parent. The council guards had frozen. 100 armed men standing motionless in the tiered galleries, their weapons drawn but their wills suspended in the vacuum created by a 73-year-old chancellor lunging at a child with a knife. That image, the Empire's highest official attacking a boy in the council chamber, had done more damage to Draven's legitimacy in 3 seconds than Seraphine's decade of preparation could have achieved in 3 years. Some things cannot be unseen. Some moments rewrite every story that came before them. Seraphine was already moving. She had pulled Cassian behind her the instant Draven drew the blade, shielding him with her body in a mirror of Kaelor's instinct. 2 parents operating on the same frequency, the same fundamental algorithm, without consultation or coordination. She looked at Kaelor's bleeding arm, and her face did something complicated. Fear and fury and relief colliding behind her eyes in a sequence too rapid to separate. "You're hurt," she said. "It's nothing." "It's not nothing." "Seraphine, later." She held his gaze for 1 second. Then she nodded and turned to the chamber. "Council members of the Regency." Her voice filled the room with the authority of a woman who had spent 10 years learning how to command attention in spaces that did not want to hear her. "You have just witnessed your chancellor attempt to murder a child, the heir to House Voss, a 10-year-old boy whose only crime is existing." The galleries were in chaos. Noble representatives shouting, standing, gesturing, the ordered hierarchy of the Empire's political class dissolving into the primal disorder of 200 people who had just watched the ground rules change. Seraphine let the chaos run for 10 seconds. Then she raised her hand. The room quieted. Not because they obeyed her, because they wanted to hear what came next. The documents on this lectern prove a 20-year conspiracy orchestrated by Chancellor Draven Ashmore to seize the Voss territories and control the Regency Council. Original letters in his hand, financial records from the council's hidden treasury, a recorded confession from his embedded operative, and a royal decree signed by King Aldrich himself, naming Duke Kaelor Voss as Lord Protector of the realm. She paused. Let the words settle. The decree was intercepted by Chancellor Ashmore before it could be entered into the official record. He has governed without legitimate authority since the king's death. Every order he has issued, every appointment he has made, every act of governance conducted under his authority is legally void. Draven was on his knees, his broken wrist hung at his side. Blood from Kaelor's wound was pooling on the marble between them, a small, dark lake that reflected the golden dome above like a mirror made of damage. Lies, Draven said, but the word came out fractured, thin, the voice of a man whose instrument had finally failed him. Lord Protector Vale, Seraphine turned to her father, present the decree to the council. Aldrich Vale walked forward. The old man moved with the deliberate pace of someone who understood that this moment was not about speed. It was about weight, about the accumulated gravity of 17 years spent protecting a single piece of parchment that proved the empire had been stolen. He placed the decree on the lectern. The royal seal caught the light from the chandeliers, deep red wax, unbroken, bearing the personal mark of a dead king whose last act of governance had been to name the one man capable of holding the empire together. I invite any member of the council, Aldrich said, to examine this document, to verify the seal, the handwriting, and the signature. I invite any member of the council to review the accompanying evidence, the chancellor's correspondence, the financial records, the sworn testimony of his operative, and I invite any member of the council to look at the man kneeling on this floor and tell me that the empire is better served by his authority than by the truth. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. The war horns outside had faded. In their place rose a different sound, the low, rhythmic percussion of an army surrounding the citadel, not attacking, but waiting, present, undeniable. The physical manifestation of 10 years of exile converted into 10,000 soldiers who answered to a woman the empire had tried to erase. The first council member to stand was Lady Cassia Mero, the youngest member of the council, representing the southern provinces. She was 32 years old, sharp-featured, with the reputation of a pragmatist who measured every political position against a single criterion: which side would still exist tomorrow. I have examined the royal seal, she said. Her voice was steady, but her hands, clasped before her, were white-knuckled. It is genuine. I recognize the king's personal mark. I have seen it on authenticated documents in the royal archive. A second council member stood, Lord Harthen, representing the Western Territories. He was older, heavier, with the weathered face of a man who governed farming provinces and measured politics in harvests rather than ambitions. I have reviewed the financial records, he said. The accounts are consistent with the council's internal ledger system. The transaction signatures match Chancellor Ashmore's authorized codes. A third, a fourth. One by one, the council members rose from their seats and added their voices to the collapse of a 20-year conspiracy, not out of courage, not out of principle, out of the cold, pragmatic recognition that the mathematics had changed irreversibly, and that the man kneeling on the floor with a broken wrist was no longer the safest horse to back. This was how empires turned, not with a single heroic act, not with a dramatic reversal that transformed villains into heroes overnight, but with the slow, grinding arithmetic of self-interest, each person in the room calculating their own survival and reaching the same conclusion, one after another, until the weight of consensus became indistinguishable from justice. The final council member to stand was Lord Seric Thane, Draven's oldest ally, a man who had co-signed half the treasonous correspondence now spread across the lectern. He rose from his seat with the mechanical stiffness of a man whose body was executing a decision his mind had not yet accepted. I move, Thane said, and his voice was hollow, for the immediate removal of Chancellor Ashmore from office, and for the recognition of Duke Kaelor Voss as Lord Protector, in accordance with the royal decree. The vote was unanimous. Not because every person in that chamber believed in justice, because every person in that chamber believed in survival, And survival, in that moment, meant aligning with the family that had walked into the most dangerous room in the Empire carrying nothing but the truth and had used it to reshape the world. Draven Ashmore was lifted from the floor by council guards who, 60 seconds earlier, had been prepared to arrest the people now commanding them. The old man did not resist. He did not speak. He walked out of the chamber with the blank, evacuated expression of a man whose 20-year performance had ended not with applause, but with the sound of his own wrist breaking in the grip of a father who had chosen, for the first time in his life, to protect something instead of possess it. The chamber doors closed behind him. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full, dense with the weight of what had just happened, with the reverberations of a political earthquake that would take months to fully assess, with the unspoken recognition that the empire that existed before this evening was gone, and the one that would replace it had not yet been built. Kaelor stood at the center of the floor. His left arm was bleeding through the makeshift bandage Seraphine had wrapped around it during the vote. The pain had arrived now. Sharp, insistent, the body's belated protest against the violence it had absorbed. He could feel his heartbeat in the wound, a rhythmic throb that synchronized with the pulse he could see in Seraphine's throat as she stood beside him. "It's over," she said. "No." He looked at the empty chancellor's chair, at the decree on the lectern, at the galleries full of nobles who were already recalculating their positions, forming new alliances, preparing for the next phase of a game that never actually ended. "It's starting." 3 days later, Kaelor stood on the balcony of the Golden Citadel and watched the capital come to terms with its new reality. The arrests had taken 48 hours. Draven's network was extensive. 17 officials across 6 departments, all connected to the hidden treasury that had funded 2 decades of conspiracy. Each arrest produced new evidence, new names, new connections that branched outward like the root system of a poisonous tree. Lyris coordinated the intelligence operation with the methodical efficiency of a woman who had spent 10 years mapping a corruption network and was now, finally, authorized to pull it apart. Marin Holt was held in a separate facility. Kaelor had not visited her. He was not certain he would. The wound she had left was not the kind that confrontation healed. It was the kind that simply existed. A permanent alteration in the landscape of his understanding. A scar in the terrain where trust used to grow. He would carry it, the way soldiers carried shrapnel. Not as a memory of the battle, but as evidence that the battle happened, that it was real, that surviving it meant something. Cash-in had been formally presented to the council on the 2nd day. The ceremony was brief, a legal acknowledgement of bloodline and succession, witnessed by representatives of every noble house. The boy stood before the council with the same composure he had shown in the bookshop, in the warehouse, in the chamber when a 73-year-old man lunged at him with a blade. He spoke his name, his lineage, and his claim in a voice that did not waver. Then he walked back to Seraphine and stood beside her, and the gesture, a child choosing his mother's side after being recognized by an empire, said more about the nature of power than any decree or declaration could have conveyed. Now Kaelor stood on the balcony and let the evening air cool the bandage on his arm. The sun was setting behind the cathedral spires, turning the city gold and copper and deep amber. Below, the streets were returning to their ordinary rhythms. Merchants, laborers, children, the ceaseless organic machinery of a capital that had survived another political upheaval and would survive the next one, because cities endured in ways that governments did not. Footsteps behind him. He did not turn. "You've been out here for 2 hours," Seraphine said. "I'm thinking." "About what?" "About the fact that everything I built in the last 20 years was built on a foundation designed by the man who wanted to destroy me. Every decision, every alliance, every territorial expansion, all of it shaped by Draven's influence, filtered through Marin's surveillance, channeled toward outcomes that served the council's agenda." He turned to face her. She was standing in the balcony doorway, leaning against the stone frame with her arms crossed. Her hair was loose, the first time he had seen it down since she returned. It changed the geometry of her face, softened the angles that exile had sharpened, and for a disorienting moment she looked like the woman who had stood in his study doorway 11 years ago and told him he treated her like a border dispute. "So what does that mean?" she asked. "That everything you accomplished was meaningless?" "I don't know. Maybe." It wasn't. She walked to the balcony railing and stood beside him, not touching. Close enough that the space between them vibrated with the particular tension of two people who had been through something that no shared vocabulary could adequately describe. Draven shaped the context. He didn't shape you. The decisions you made, how you governed, how you treated the people under your authority, the kind of duke you chose to be. Those were yours. The kind of duke I chose to be drove you away. No, the conspiracy drove me away. You made it easier to leave. That's different. He looked at her. Is it? Yes, because the man I left was someone I loved who didn't know how to be loved back. That's not the same as the man Draven was trying to create. Draven wanted you isolated, suspicious, controlling. You were those things, but not because of him, because of your father's death, because of what you learned at 12 years old about what happens to people who let their guard down. And now? Now you know that keeping your guard up cost you 10 years with your son, with me. She paused. The evening light caught the amber flecks in her eyes. The same eyes he had fallen in love with in a crumbling estate 11 years ago, before either of them understood what they were building or what it would cost. The question is whether knowing that changes anything. The silence between them was not hostile. It was not strategic. It was the silence of two people standing at the edge of something they could not see the bottom of, trying to determine whether the fall was survivable. I don't know how to do this, Kaelor said. The same words he had spoken to her in his study 11 years ago. The most honest sentence he possessed. I know, she said. The same answer. But I want to learn. That was new. Seraphine turned her head and looked at him directly. The assessment was thorough. She searched his face the way she searched intelligence reports, looking for inconsistencies, for the gap between what was said and what was meant, for the hidden architecture beneath the visible structure. She found something. Whatever it was, whatever shift in the geology of his expression, told her that the man standing on this balcony was not performing honesty, but inhabiting it. Her composure changed, not cracked, not broken, opened, like a window that had been sealed for years, letting in air that smelled like dust and lavender and the specific, unreproducible scent of a future that might actually be different from the past. Then we start over, she said. Not from scratch, from here. With everything we know and everything we've lost, and the full, stupid, terrifying understanding that this might not work. That's not very reassuring. It's not supposed to be. She almost smiled. Not quite. The ghost of a smile. The shadow it would cast if the light hit it from the right angle. Reassuring is what people say when they want you to stop asking questions. I want you to keep asking. He reached for her hand, slowly, giving her time to pull away if the gesture was too much, too soon, too loaded with the weight of a decade of absence and the impossible task of rebuilding trust from the wreckage of what it used to be. She did not pull away. Her fingers closed around his. The grip was not gentle. It was not romantic. It was the grip of a woman holding on to something she had fought for across 10 years and 3 countries and an empire that tried to erase her, holding it the way you hold a rope over a chasm. With everything you have. Because letting go is not an option you can afford. They stood like that on the balcony of the Golden Citadel while the sun finished setting and the capital settled into the blue half-light between day and night. Two people who had been broken by the same conspiracy, separated by the same lie, and reunited by the specific, improbable alchemy of a woman who refused to let the empire destroy her family, and a man who finally learned that the thing he had been trying to possess was the thing that could only survive if he set it free. Below them, the city breathed. Tomorrow, there would be councils, negotiations, the immense grinding work of rebuilding an empire from the fractures left by 20 years of orchestrated corruption. There would be hearings and judgments, and the slow, difficult process of establishing a new political order from the ruins of the old one. Kaelor would need to govern differently, not just with strategy and force, but with the terrifying openness of a man who understood that the walls he built to protect himself were the same walls that imprisoned him. But that was tomorrow. Tonight, Cassian appeared in the balcony doorway. He stood there for a moment, watching his parents with the quiet intensity of a child who had spent his entire life studying the relationship between these two people from a distance, through his mother's stories, through the intelligence reports he was not supposed to read, through the decoded letters and the intercepted dispatches, and the thousand small pieces of information that, assembled over 10 years, had formed a picture of a love that was more complicated and more durable than anything the Empire's poets had ever described. "Is it safe?" he asked. The question was simple, a child asking whether the world outside was dangerous. But the weight beneath it was vast. 10 years of exile, of hidden identities, of the constant corrosive vigilance that came from being the most wanted child in the Empire, compressed into 3 words that meant more than political safety. Is it safe to stop running? Is it safe to stop hiding? Is it safe to be your son in a world that tried to use me as a weapon against you? Kaelor released Seraphine's hand and walked to the doorway. He knelt. The Duke of Voss, the newly named Lord Protector of the realm, the most powerful man in the Empire, knelt on the stone floor of the Golden Citadel and looked at his son at eye level. "I don't know," he said. "I can't promise you that it's safe. I can't promise you that people won't try to hurt you or use you or take you away from us. The world doesn't work that way. People who promise safety are either lying or selling something." Cassian studied his father's face with those gray eyes that missed nothing. "Then what can you promise?" Kaelor thought about it, not for performance, not for effect. He thought about it because the question deserved the truth, and the truth required a kind of precision that he had spent his entire adult life avoiding. The precision of a man who knows exactly what he can and cannot guarantee, and who chooses to say both. "I can promise you that I will be here," he said, "every morning, every night, for every fight, every decision, every mistake you make, and every mistake I make. I can promise that I will never again choose the Empire over you, and I can promise that I will spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of the fact that your mother kept you alive for 10 years when I couldn't." Cassian was quiet for a long time. The evening air moved through the balcony, carrying the sounds of the city below. Horses, voices, the distant clatter of a market closing for the night. "That's a lot of promises," the boy said. "It is. Can you keep them?" "I don't know, but I'm going to try, every single day, even when I fail at it." Something shifted in Cassian's expression. Not trust. Trust was too large a thing to arrive in a single conversation, on a single evening, after a single day of shared catastrophe. But the possibility of trust, the doorway to it. The recognition that the man kneeling before him was not the invincible duke from his mother's stories or the terrifying warlord from the Empire's mythology, but a human being who had been broken by the same forces that had shaped Cassian's exile, and who was now, for the first time, willing to admit that the breaking had happened. "Okay," Cassian said. One word. Carrying the weight of 10 years and the fragile, extraordinary courage of a child who decides to let someone in. Kaelor stood. His left arm ached. The bandage was dark with dried blood. His body was running on the fumes of the most devastating day of his life, and the exhaustion was starting to arrive. Not just physical, but existential. The deep fatigue of a man who has shed an entire identity and has not yet built the one that will replace it. Seraphine appeared beside Cassian in the doorway. She put her hand on the boy's shoulder and looked at Kaelor, and in her expression he saw the thing she had carried across 10 years of exile. The thing that had powered every decision, every alliance, every midnight strategy session in hidden camps beyond the Empire's borders. Not hatred for Draven, not ambition for the throne, not even the fierce, unyielding instinct to protect her child, although that was there too, woven into every fiber of her operational existence. It was simpler than all of that. It was the belief, stubborn, irrational, unsupported by evidence, and sustained entirely by the kind of conviction that rational people call foolishness and survivors call fuel, that the man she married was capable of becoming the man she needed him to be. She had bet everything on that belief. And standing on the balcony of the Golden Citadel, with a bandaged arm and an empty hand and a son he had known for less than a day, Kaelor Voss, the man who once believed that power meant possession, that strength meant control, that love was a territory you conquered and defended and held until your grip failed, finally understood what she had known all along. The strongest thing he had ever done was not commanding an army. It was not crushing a conspiracy. It was not standing alone in a council chamber while 100 swords surrounded him. The strongest thing he had ever done was kneeling on a stone floor and telling a 10-year-old boy the truth, that he did not have the answers, that he could not guarantee the outcome, that the only thing he could offer was presence, the daily, unglamorous, terrifyingly vulnerable act of showing up and trying and failing and trying again, without the armor of certainty, without the fortress of control, without the comforting lie that the strongest man in the room is the one who never needs anyone. The empire would heal, slowly, imperfectly, the way all living things heal, with scar tissue and adaptation and the gradual, painful acceptance that the body you inhabit after the wound is not the body you had before it. The conspirators would face judgment. Their fortunes would be stripped. Their names would fade from the official histories, replaced by the footnotes that history reserves for men who believed their power was permanent and discovered, too late, that the only permanent thing is the truth they tried to bury. Cassian would grow into what neither parent could predict. But he would grow in the open, in the light, in the presence of a father who had learned, at the cost of 20 years and an empire's worth of damage, that children are not territory to be secured. They are people to be trusted, and trust, once given, creates a kind of architecture that no conspiracy can undermine and no betrayal can collapse, because it is built not on control, but on choice. The daily, deliberate, terrifying choice to let someone matter more than your own survival. Kaelor reached out and took Seraphine's hand again. With the other hand, the bandaged one, the damaged one, the hand that would carry the scar from Draven's blade for the rest of his life, he placed it on his son's shoulder. The three of them stood on the balcony of the Golden Citadel as the last light drained from the sky and the capital settled into darkness, and the stars came out one by one above an empire that belonged, for the first time in 20 years, not to the strongest conqueror, but to the family that survived every attempt to destroy it. The Duke of Voss had spent his life acquiring territory. Standing in the darkness with his wife's hand in his and his son's shoulder beneath his palm, he finally understood that the only empire worth having was the one you could not draw a line around, the one that did not appear on any map, the one that endured not because you held it, but because it held you.